That feeling when you're driving late at night and you pass one of those massive industrial complexes that seems to glow against the darkness, the kind of place that makes you wonder what exactly goes on behind those towering walls and endless rows of security lights. Well, I've got a story for you that'll make you think twice about those mysterious facilities you see scattered across the American landscape. This story comes from someone who worked at one of the most secretive industrial operations in the country, a place that officially doesn't exist on any public records, but processes materials so dangerous that the workers there follow protocols that would make a nuclear facility look relaxed. And what happened there over the course of just 3 months changed everything. We thought we knew about industrial safety, government oversight, and the lengths some organizations will go to protect their secrets. Before we dive into this incredible account, I want you to imagine working at a place where your employee handbook is literally classified, where asking the wrong question could end your career, and where the safety briefings include procedures for situations that officially never happen. That's where our story takes place, in the shadows of American industry, where some of the most important work in the country happens in complete secrecy. Our storyteller worked as a quality control inspector at what we'll call Facility 7, a designation that appeared nowhere in their official employment documents. Located in a remote area of Nevada, about 90 miles from the nearest town, this facility processed rare earth materials for what employees were told were national security applications. But as you will soon discover, the reality of what went on there was far more complex and dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The recruitment process alone should have been a red flag. Unlike typical industrial jobs, applicants for positions at Facility 7 underwent background checks that took 6 months to complete. They investigated not just the applicant, but their family members, college roommates, and even casual acquaintances from years past. The interview process involved polygraph tests, psychological evaluations, and something called a loyalty assessment that no one was allowed to discuss afterward. Those who made it through the screening process signed employment contracts, unlike anything in typical industry. The non-disclosure agreements weren't just about protecting trade secrets. They covered everything from the facility's location to the number of employees, from the work schedules to the cafeteria menu. Violation of these agreements didn't just mean losing your job. It meant potential federal prosecution under laws most people have never heard of. The first day on the job was when the real strangeness began. New employees weren't given a traditional orientation. Instead, they were handed a device that looked like a modified tablet computer and told to complete something called protocol familiarization training. This wasn't your standard workplace safety course. The training modules covered procedures for containment breaches, protocols for unexplained equipment malfunctions, and emergency responses for what the system cryptically referred to as anomalous events. The facility itself defied easy description. From the outside, it looked like a typical industrial complex. Warehouses, processing buildings, and administrative offices surrounded by the usual security fencing. But the moment you passed through the main gate, you realized this was unlike any workplace in America. The security wasn't just tight, it was paranoid. Guards carried equipment that definitely wasn't standard issue, and the scanning procedures to enter different sections of the facility involved technology that seemed decades ahead of anything available commercially. The work areas were even stranger. The processing floor, where rare earth materials were refined, looked normal enough during the day shift. But the night shift workers whispered about equipment that operated differently after dark, about processing procedures that only happened when skeleton crews were on duty, and about sections of the facility that were completely off-limits except during what management called special operations periods. Our storyteller was assigned to Quality Control Team C, which was responsible for testing materials during what the official schedule listed as secondary processing phases. What made this assignment unusual wasn't the work itself. Testing material purity and composition was standard industrial practice. What was unusual were the protocols surrounding the work. Every sample had to be logged with a code that corresponded to nothing in the official documentation. Every test result was entered into a computer system that wasn't connected to the facility's main network. And every shift ended with a procedure called memory verification that involved answering detailed questions about exactly what each employee had observed during their work period. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came during the second week of employment. A coworker named Davidson, who had been at the facility for over a year, mentioned casually during lunch that he'd been having strange dreams since starting work there. Not just work-related anxiety dreams, but detailed, vivid dreams about the facility that included areas he'd never seen and procedures he'd never been trained on. When he mentioned this to other long-time employees, they just nodded knowingly and told him it was normal, that it would pass after a few months. But Davidson's dreams didn't pass. If anything, they became more frequent and more detailed. He started describing areas of the facility that, according to the official layout, didn't exist. He talked about underground levels that went far deeper than the basement storage areas employees were allowed to access. He described equipment that processed materials in ways that seemed to violate basic principles of chemistry and physics. Management's response to Davidson's situation was swift and unsettling. He was reassigned from quality control to what was euphemistically called administrative duties, which meant spending his shifts in a windowless office, reviewing documentation that apparently consisted entirely of redacted pages. Within a month, Davidson stopped talking about his dreams altogether. When pressed by coworkers, he would just say that everything was fine now, that he'd been mistaken about what he thought he'd seen in his sleep. The incident with Davidson might have been dismissed as workplace stress or an overactive imagination, but it wasn't an isolated case. Other employees began reporting similar experiences, dreams that felt more like memories, detailed knowledge of procedures they'd never been taught, and a growing sense that the official explanation for the facility's operations didn't match what they were actually witnessing. The breaking point came during what the official logs recorded as a routine maintenance shutdown in the facility's third month of operation under the new protocols. Our storyteller was part of the skeleton crew that remained on site during the shutdown to monitor the processing equipment as it powered down. What should have been a straightforward procedure turned into something that challenged everything anyone thought they knew about industrial operations. The shutdown was scheduled to begin at midnight on a Tuesday, with all processing equipment gradually reducing output over a 6-hour period. But as the night progressed, it became clear that the equipment wasn't responding to the shutdown commands in the expected way. Instead of gradually reducing activity, several processing units seemed to be increasing their energy consumption while producing no detectable output. The facility's monitoring systems showed readings that didn't make sense. Temperature gauges indicated that certain processing chambers were reaching levels that should have melted the equipment, yet infrared cameras showed no heat signatures in those areas. Radiation detectors registered spikes that should have triggered automatic evacuation procedures, yet the personal dosimeters worn by all employees showed normal background levels. Most disturbing of all, the materials being processed seemed to be disappearing, not consumed or transformed into other compounds, but literally vanishing from the system. Hoppers that had been loaded with tons of rare earth ores were empty by morning, with no corresponding increase in processed materials in the output containers. The computer systems registered the materials as having been processed successfully, but there was no physical evidence that anything had actually happened. The response from management to these anomalies was perhaps more unsettling than the anomalies themselves. Instead of investigating the equipment malfunctions or trying to account for the missing materials, supervisors acted as if everything had proceeded normally. Work orders were marked as completed. Quality control reports were filed showing satisfactory processing results, and the facility returned to normal operations as if nothing unusual had occurred. But the employees who had witnessed the shutdown couldn't forget what they'd seen. They began comparing notes during breaks, trying to piece together what had actually happened that night. What they discovered was that their individual observations, taken together, painted a picture of operations that went far beyond anything in their official job descriptions. Some employees had noticed that certain areas of the facility became inaccessible during the shutdown, with security doors that were normally open suddenly requiring clearance levels that didn't appear in any of the facility documentation. Others had observed personnel in the facility that night who weren't on any of the official work schedules, people in uniforms that didn't match any of the standard facility departments, operating equipment that wasn't listed in any of the maintenance manuals. The most unsettling discoveries came from the employees with access to the facility's computerized monitoring systems. Hidden within the standard operational logs were data streams that corresponded to no known equipment. These phantom data streams showed continuous activity, even when the official systems indicated that all processing had stopped. The data itself was encrypted, using methods that none of the facility's IT staff recognized, and attempts to trace the source of these signals led to system components that couldn't be located anywhere in the facility's documented architecture. As word of these discoveries spread among the employees, management implemented what they called enhanced security protocols. These protocols included random polygraph tests for all personnel, increased surveillance in common areas, and a new policy requiring employees to report any unusual observations or conversations to facility security. The message was clear. Asking questions about the facility's operations was no longer just discouraged. It was potentially dangerous to your continued employment, but the enhanced security measures had an unintended consequence. Instead of stopping employees from investigating the anomalies they'd witnessed, it convinced them that something genuinely important was being hidden. Small groups of employees began meeting off-site to share information and to try to piece together the true nature of the facility's operations. What they uncovered was a pattern of activities that suggested Facility 7 wasn't just processing rare earth materials for national security applications. The evidence pointed to something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Operations that seemed designed not just to process materials, but to study and possibly exploit phenomena that existed outside the boundaries of conventional science. The breakthrough came when one employee managed to access historical records that had been improperly archived in the facility's computer system. These records showed that Facility 7 had been in operation far longer than any of the current employees had been told. References in the documents suggested that the facility had been processing anomalous materials since the 1970s, with operations expanding significantly in the late 1990s following what was described as a major acquisition event. The acquisition event, according to the fragmented records, involved the recovery of materials from an undisclosed location that displayed properties unlike any known substances. These materials were apparently immune to standard analysis methods, maintained their structural integrity under conditions that should have destroyed them, and seemed to influence nearby equipment in ways that defied explanation. The rare earth processing operations that formed the official mission of Facility 7 appeared to be a cover for the real work. Studying these anomalous materials and attempting to understand or replicate their unusual properties, the dreams that employees like Davidson had experienced weren't random subconscious events. They were apparently side effects of prolonged exposure to whatever forces or energies the facility was actually working with. This revelation cast new light on many of the facility's seemingly nonsensical procedures. The classified employee handbooks weren't protecting industrial secrets. They were protecting knowledge of phenomena that could potentially revolutionize human understanding of physics, chemistry, and material science. The extensive background checks weren't just about security clearances. They were about identifying individuals who would be psychologically capable of handling exposure to genuinely paradigm-shifting discoveries. The loyalty assessments that all employees underwent during the hiring process weren't about patriotism or company dedication. They were psychological evaluations designed to identify individuals who would be least likely to suffer adverse mental effects from working with materials and energies that challenged basic assumptions about reality. As this understanding spread among the facility's workforce, the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Employees were torn between genuine scientific curiosity about what they were involved in and growing concern about the potential dangers of their work. The safety protocols they followed daily suddenly took on new significance when viewed not as protection against industrial accidents, but as safeguards against exposure to forces that weren't fully understood. The situation reached a crisis point when several employees began experiencing physical symptoms that couldn't be explained by conventional occupational health standards. Workers reported episodes of disorientation, temporary memory loss, and periods where they would find themselves in areas of the facility with no recollection of how they'd gotten there. Medical examinations revealed nothing abnormal, but the symptoms persisted and seemed to worsen with continued exposure to the facility's operations. More disturbing were reports from employees' family members. Spouses and children of facility workers began having dreams similar to those reported by the employees themselves. Detailed visions of underground facilities, advanced technology, and operations involving materials that seemed to behave according to their own mysterious rules. Some family members reported knowledge of technical procedures they couldn't possibly have learned through normal means, as if information was somehow being transmitted beyond the boundaries of the facility itself. The implications of these developments were staggering. If the facility's operations were somehow affecting people who had never even visited the site, then the scope of what was happening at Facility 7 went far beyond anything in the realm of conventional industrial activity. The materials being processed there weren't just anomalous, they were actively influencing human consciousness in ways that suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of reality itself. Management's response to these developments was to implement what they called total information compartmentalization. Employees were reassigned to different shifts to prevent them from coordinating their observations. Access to computer systems was further restricted, with each worker limited to only the specific data necessary for their immediate tasks. Most significantly, a new policy was implemented, requiring all employees to undergo weekly cognitive assessments that were ostensibly designed to monitor mental health, but seemed more focused on detecting and suppressing awareness of the facility's true operations. The cognitive assessments were perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the enhanced security measures, conducted by personnel who weren't part of the facility's regular medical staff. These sessions involved questioning techniques that seemed designed to identify not just what employees knew, but what they suspected or had dreamed about. Employees who showed too much curiosity about the facility's operations would be placed on administrative leave for mental health evaluation, and many never returned to work. Those who did return were changed. They would speak in vague terms about their experiences during the leave period, describing treatment that had helped them understand the importance of focusing only on their assigned duties. They seemed to have lost all curiosity about the facility's anomalous aspects, accepting the official explanations for even the most obviously impossible events. The transformation of these employees was so complete and so rapid that it raised disturbing questions about what kind of treatment they had received. Some co-workers suspected that advanced psychological conditioning techniques were being used to suppress awareness of the facility's true operations. Others theorized that the same forces affecting the materials processing might be capable of directly influencing human memory and perception. As the situation at Facility 7 continued to deteriorate, a small group of employees made the decision to document their experiences and attempt to expose what they believed was a massive cover-up of potentially world-changing discoveries. Led by our storyteller, and including several other quality control specialists who had witnessed the anomalous events firsthand, this group began secretly gathering evidence of the facility's true operations. Their investigation revealed that Facility 7 was part of a much larger network of similar facilities scattered across remote locations throughout the American West. Each facility appeared to be specializing in different aspects of what seemed to be a coordinated research program into phenomena that existed outside the boundaries of accepted science. Some facilities focused on materials research, others on energy applications, and still others on what internal documents referred to as consciousness interface studies. The scope of the program suggested government involvement at the highest levels, with funding mechanisms that bypassed normal congressional oversight and operational security that exceeded even classified military programs. References in the recovered documents suggested that the research had been ongoing for decades, with significant breakthroughs occurring regularly, but never being disclosed to the scientific community or the public. The most disturbing discovery was evidence that the program's researchers had developed applications for their anomalous materials that went far beyond simple industrial uses. Internal memos discussed projects involving energy generation systems that produced output far exceeding their input, transportation technologies that seemed to manipulate space-time itself, and communication systems that operated through mechanisms that bore no resemblance to conventional electronics. The implications of these discoveries were staggering. If the technologies referenced in the documents were real and functional, they represented advances that could transform human civilization overnight. Clean energy, faster than light travel, instantaneous communication across any distance. The applications seemed limited only by imagination, but the documents also revealed a darker side to the research program. References to containment failures, dimensional intrusions, and consciousness contamination events suggested that the researchers were working with forces they didn't fully understand or control. Some projects had apparently been terminated due to unacceptable reality distortion effects, while others were suspended pending development of better metaphysical safety protocols. The employees investigating these matters realized they were dealing with something that went beyond corporate secrecy or even national security classification. They were uncovering evidence of a research program that was actively suppressing discoveries that could benefit all of humanity, while simultaneously pursuing applications of those discoveries that might pose existential risks to human civilization. The decision to go public with their findings was not made lightly. The employees knew that exposing the facility's operations would likely end their careers and possibly put them in physical danger. The security measures at Facility 7 were designed not just to protect industrial secrets, but to prevent disclosure of information that some individuals or organizations clearly considered worth killing to protect. But the potential benefits of disclosure seemed to outweigh the personal risks. If the technologies being developed at Facility 7 and similar installations were real, the public had a right to know about them. More importantly, if these technologies posed potential dangers, the scientific community needed to be involved in assessing and controlling those risks. The employees' plan was to gather as much documentation as possible, establish secure communication channels with investigative journalists and sympathetic scientists, and coordinate a simultaneous release of information that would be too widespread to suppress effectively. They knew they would have only one chance to get their story out before the facility's security apparatus moved to silence them. The execution of their plan revealed just how sophisticated the facility's security really was. Within hours of their first attempt to contact outside investigators, facility management became aware of their activities. The response was swift and comprehensive. The employees involved were detained on site under provisions of their employment contracts that authorized indefinite isolation for security assessment purposes. The detention facility where they were held was located in previously unknown sections of the complex, underground levels that didn't appear on any of the official architectural plans. The conditions weren't harsh, but the psychological pressure was intense. Detainees were subjected to continuous questioning about their motivations, their methods, and their plans for disseminating the information they had gathered. The interrogation techniques were unlike anything in conventional law enforcement or military practice, sessions that seemed designed not just to extract information, but to fundamentally alter the subject's perception of reality itself. During these sessions, detainees reported experiencing periods of disorientation where they couldn't distinguish between their actual memories and scenarios presented to them by their interrogators. They were shown footage of events that they remembered witnessing at the facility, but the footage showed completely different occurrences, normal industrial operations instead of the anomalous phenomena they recalled observing. The psychological impact of this contradiction was devastating, leaving many detainees questioning their own sanity. The interrogation rooms themselves seemed designed to enhance these effects. The walls displayed patterns that hurt to look at directly, creating a constant low-level sensory stress that made concentration difficult. The lighting varied in ways that disrupted circadian rhythms, while ambient sounds included frequencies that seemed to interfere with normal thought processes. Most unsettling of all, detainees reported that the rooms seemed larger or smaller at different times, as if the physical space itself was somehow unstable. After several days of this treatment, the detainees were offered what their captors described as a choice. They could accept therapeutic intervention that would help them understand why their memories of facility operations had become distorted, allowing them to return to normal lives and productive careers. Alternatively, they could maintain their delusional beliefs and remain in detention indefinitely while receiving more intensive treatment designed to restore their grasp on reality. The therapeutic intervention, as described by facility medical personnel, involved advanced neurofeedback techniques that could help correct the perceptual distortions that had led the employees to misinterpret normal industrial operations as something mysterious or threatening. The treatment was presented as a form of mental health care, designed to help individuals who had developed paranoid delusions as a result of workplace stress and exposure to complex technical procedures they didn't fully understand. Several of the detainees worn down by days of psychological pressure and unable to trust their own memories, agreed to the treatment. Those who underwent the intervention emerged after several weeks with no recollection of the anomalous events that had originally motivated their investigation. They spoke of their previous concerns as embarrassing episodes of workplace paranoia, expressing gratitude for the medical care that had helped them recognize how stress and overwork had distorted their perception of routine industrial operations. But our storyteller and 2 other employees refused the treatment, insisting that their observations had been accurate and that the facility was engaged in operations far beyond anything in its official mission statement. Their continued resistance led to escalation of the intervention protocols, with techniques that seemed designed to break down their psychological defenses through methods that bore little resemblance to legitimate medical treatment. The advanced intervention techniques involved exposure to sensory experiences that challenged basic assumptions about physical reality. Subjects were placed in chambers where the laws of physics seemed to operate differently, spaces where gravity appeared variable, where light behaved in impossible ways, and where time itself seemed to flow inconsistently. The psychological impact of these experiences was intended to demonstrate that human perception was fundamentally unreliable, making it easier for subjects to accept alternative explanations for what they thought they had witnessed. During one particularly intense session, our storyteller was shown what appeared to be the actual operations taking place at Facility 7. But instead of vindication, this revelation became another form of psychological torture. The subject was forced to witness processes that were clearly far beyond conventional industrial capacity, materials that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, energy patterns that created localized distortions in space-time, and equipment that operated according to principles that hadn't been discovered by mainstream science. But after witnessing these impossible operations, the subject was then shown identical footage of the same areas during normal business hours, where everything appeared completely routine. The same spaces that had contained reality-bending technology during the night shift showed nothing but standard industrial equipment during the day. The psychological impact of this contradiction was intended to convince the subject that their perception of anomalous events was a form of hallucination or mental illness. The treatment sessions revealed that the facility's operations were even more complex than the investigating employees had suspected. The anomalous activities weren't constant. They occurred only during specific time windows, when certain atmospheric and electromagnetic conditions were optimal. During these windows, the facility would activate equipment and processes that seemed to access dimensions or energy sources that existed outside normal space-time. The rare Earth processing that formed the facility's official mission was apparently necessary to create specific environmental conditions that allowed these advanced operations to function. The materials being processed weren't valuable for their conventional industrial applications, but for their ability to create localized fields that stabilized the exotic physics required for the facility's true research objectives. This revelation explained many of the previously puzzling aspects of facility operations. The extensive psychological screening wasn't just about security clearances. It was about identifying individuals whose consciousness could adapt to exposure to these exotic physical phenomena without suffering permanent mental damage. The loyalty assessments were designed to identify people who could maintain operational security even when dealing with discoveries that challenged their entire understanding of reality. The classified employee handbooks contained not just security protocols, but detailed procedures for working safely around technology that operated according to physical laws that hadn't been publicly acknowledged. The memory verification procedures weren't about preventing security leaks. They were medical assessments designed to monitor employees for signs of the consciousness distortion effects that prolonged exposure to exotic physics could cause. As the treatment sessions continued, our storyteller began to understand that the facility was part of a research program that had been making revolutionary discoveries for decades while maintaining absolute secrecy about their work. The implications of public disclosure weren't just about corporate profits or national security. They concerned the stability of human civilization itself. The technologies being developed at Facility 7 and similar installations were apparently powerful enough to fundamentally alter the nature of human existence. Clean energy systems that could provide unlimited power, transportation methods that could make any point on Earth accessible within minutes, communication technologies that could connect human consciousness directly without need for electronic intermediaries. The applications were limitless, but the research had also revealed dangers that mainstream science was completely unprepared to address. Some experiments had produced results that suggested reality itself was far more fragile than anyone had suspected. Certain combinations of exotic materials and energy field had created what researchers termed stability anomalies, regions where the fundamental laws of physics became variable or ceased to function entirely. The research documents that our storyteller was allowed to see during the treatment sessions described several incidents where containment of these anomalies had failed, creating effects that persisted long after the experimental apparatus was shut down. In some cases, entire sections of research facilities had been permanently evacuated due to ongoing reality distortions that made those areas uninhabitable for normal human consciousness. The most disturbing revelations concerned what the research program called consciousness interface phenomena. Some of the exotic materials being studied apparently had the ability to directly influence human neural activity, creating effects that ranged from enhanced cognitive abilities to complete personality restructuring. These materials seemed to serve as conduits between human consciousness and whatever dimensional spaces or energy sources the facilities were accessing. The dreams that facility employees experienced weren't random side effects. They were apparently forms of information transfer that occurred when human consciousness came into contact with these exotic materials. The detailed knowledge that employees gained through their dreams was real information about advanced technologies and scientific principles transmitted through mechanisms that bypassed normal sensory channels. This explained why family members of facility employees were also affected. The consciousness interface effects weren't limited by physical proximity to the materials themselves, but could apparently propagate through quantum entanglement or other non-local phenomena. Once an individual's consciousness had been tagged by exposure to the exotic materials, they could continue receiving information transfers regardless of their physical location. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If consciousness could interface directly with exotic dimensional phenomena, then human mental evolution might be possible on timescales far shorter than conventional evolutionary processes would allow. But the same mechanisms that could enhance human cognitive abilities might also be capable of fundamentally altering human nature itself. The treatment sessions revealed that some research subjects had undergone consciousness modifications that gave them abilities resembling what previous generations would have considered supernatural. Enhanced pattern recognition that bordered on precognition, communication abilities that functioned across vast distances without technological assistance, and manipulation of local physical phenomena through focused mental effort. These individuals had essentially become something beyond baseline human, with capabilities that couldn't be explained by any currently accepted scientific theories. But the transformation process was apparently dangerous and irreversible. Some research subjects had experienced consciousness modifications that left them unable to function in normal society. They required specialized containment facilities where they could exist without causing reality distortions that might affect other people. Others had undergone changes that made them effectively immortal, but psychologically incompatible with unmodified humans. The research program had apparently been struggling with the ethical implications of these discoveries for decades. The potential benefits of controlled consciousness enhancement were obvious: elimination of mental illness, dramatic increases in cognitive ability, and direct interface capabilities with advanced technological systems. But the risks included the possibility of accidentally creating post-human entities that might view unmodified humans as an obsolete species. As our storyteller processed these revelations during the extended treatment sessions, it became clear that the facility's security measures weren't just about protecting research secrets. They were about preventing the premature release of technologies that could trigger a consciousness evolution event that humanity might not be prepared to survive. The researchers had apparently concluded that careful, controlled development of these technologies was essential to avoid catastrophic outcomes for human civilization. The employees who had attempted to expose the facility's operations had unknowingly been threatening to trigger exactly the kind of uncontrolled disclosure that could lead to civilizational collapse. If the exotic technologies were released without proper preparation and safeguards, the results could range from global economic disruption to complete breakdown of social order as existing power structures became obsolete overnight. The psychological pressure of understanding these implications was enormous. Our storyteller was forced to grapple with the realization that their well-intentioned attempt to expose what they saw as a cover-up had actually been an effort to prevent a potentially species-ending disaster. The moral complexity of the situation made it almost impossible to determine who were the heroes and who were the villains in this scenario. The treatment sessions continued for weeks, with each session revealing additional layers of complexity in the facility's operations. The exotic materials being processed weren't just scientifically interesting. They were apparently samples recovered from sources that challenged basic assumptions about Earth's history and humanity's place in the universe. Some materials showed evidence of artificial origin by non-human intelligence, while others seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time and could only be studied using specially modified equipment. The rare Earth processing operations that served as the facility's cover story were necessary because conventional materials, science lacked the theoretical framework to understand how the exotic materials functioned. Researchers had been forced to develop entirely new branches of physics and chemistry to work with substances that didn't behave according to any known natural laws. The processing procedures weren't designed to refine materials for conventional applications, but to create hybrid substances that could serve as interfaces between normal matter and the exotic materials. The underground levels of the facility that employees had glimpsed in their dreams were real, but they extended far deeper than anyone had imagined. Some levels were apparently excavated specifically to house equipment that required isolation from Earth's electromagnetic field and gravitational influences. Other levels had been built to contain experiments that posed risks to the local space-time continuum and needed to be physically separated from normal dimensional space. The personnel in unrecognized uniforms that employees had observed during the facility shutdown weren't part of the official staff. They were specialists from other facilities in the research network who were brought in during special operations that required expertise in particularly dangerous or sensitive procedures. These individuals underwent consciousness modifications that allowed them to work safely with the most exotic materials, while maintaining psychological stability under conditions that would drive unmodified humans insane. The phantom data streams that quality control employees had discovered in the facility's computer systems weren't malfunctions. They were monitoring feeds from equipment that existed in parallel dimensional spaces accessible from the facility. Some experiments required apparatus that couldn't function in normal space-time, so researchers had developed methods for accessing adjacent dimensional regions where different physical laws allowed more advanced technologies to operate. As our storyteller absorbed these revelations, the treatment sessions began to focus on what the facility's medical personnel described as integration therapy. This process was designed to help subjects understand how the knowledge they had gained could be incorporated into their worldview without causing psychological breakdown or social dysfunction. The goal wasn't to make them forget what they had learned, but to help them understand why that knowledge had to remain secret. The integration therapy revealed that the research program had been preparing for eventual public disclosure of their discoveries, but only after decades of additional development to create proper safeguards and social preparation mechanisms. The technologies being developed were powerful enough to solve most of humanity's current problems, but they were also dangerous enough to destroy civilization if implemented incorrectly. The consciousness interface phenomena that allowed direct mental access to advanced knowledge was apparently the key to safely managing the transition to post-human technological capability. By gradually enhancing human cognitive abilities and allowing people to mentally interface with the exotic technologies, researchers hoped to create a controlled evolution process that would allow humanity to adapt to radically advanced capabilities without losing essential human characteristics. But this process required careful management over generational timescales. Premature disclosure of the technologies would likely trigger social panic and potentially violent conflicts as existing power structures attempted to monopolize or suppress the revolutionary capabilities. The research program had apparently concluded that gradual secret development with the eventual controlled disclosure was the only path that didn't lead to civilizational collapse or human extinction. The facility employees who had attempted to expose these operations weren't evil or misguided. They were simply unaware of the full implications of what they were trying to reveal. Their desire for transparency and public accountability was admirable. But in this specific case, it could have triggered exactly the kind of premature disclosure that the research program was working to prevent. As the treatment sessions neared their conclusion, our storyteller was faced with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. They could accept the integration therapy that would allow them to retain their knowledge while understanding why it had to remain secret, or they could undergo the memory modification procedures that would erase their awareness of the facility's true operations entirely. The integration therapy wasn't designed to create loyal employees or compliant subjects. It was intended to create informed participants in humanity's carefully managed evolution toward post-human capability. Individuals who completed the therapy successfully would be offered positions in the expanded research program, with opportunities to contribute to the development of technologies that would eventually transform human civilization. But participation required accepting the moral complexity of maintaining secrecy about discoveries that could immediately benefit millions of people while posing existential risks to the entire species. It meant understanding that sometimes protecting humanity required making decisions that seemed cruel or unethical from conventional moral perspectives. After weeks of psychological pressure and revelation, our storyteller made their decision. They accepted the integration therapy, understanding that they were choosing to become part of a conspiracy that was simultaneously the greatest threat and the greatest hope for human survival. The knowledge they would carry for the rest of their lives would be both a tremendous privilege and an enormous burden. The final phases of the integration therapy involved direct exposure to some of the consciousness interface phenomena that the facility had been studying. Our storyteller was allowed to experience firsthand the expanded cognitive abilities that resulted from controlled interaction with the exotic materials. The experience was transformative. Suddenly complex scientific and technological concepts that had required years of study to understand became intuitively obvious. Mathematical relationships that described the behavior of exotic materials became as clear and simple as basic arithmetic. But the enhanced cognitive abilities came with a price. The individual's perception of normal human society became fundamentally altered. The concerns and conflicts that occupied most people's attention seemed trivial compared to the cosmic-scale implications of the research program's discoveries. Maintaining relationships with unmodified humans required constant effort to suppress awareness of how limited their understanding of reality actually was. The integration therapy concluded with our storyteller being offered a new position within the research program, not as a quality control inspector at a single facility, but as a liaison coordinator responsible for managing the psychological integration of new personnel across multiple installations. The work would involve helping other individuals navigate the same consciousness expansion process they had just completed, preparing them for roles in humanity's carefully managed evolution toward post-human capability. Accepting this position meant abandoning any hope of returning to a normal life or conventional career. But it also meant participating in work that would ultimately determine whether human civilization survived its transition to radically advanced technological capability. The choice was between personal freedom and species-level responsibility. Our storyteller accepted the position, understanding that they were now part of something that transcended individual concerns or conventional moral frameworks. The story they had lived through wasn't just about industrial secrecy or government cover-ups. It was about humanity's first tentative steps toward becoming something greater than it had ever been before. The final revelation came during the orientation for their new position. The research program wasn't just studying exotic materials and consciousness interface phenomena. It was preparing for contact with the non-human intelligence that had originally created some of the materials being studied. The consciousness enhancement technologies weren't just human innovations. They were tools that would be necessary for meaningful communication with entities whose mental capabilities far exceeded baseline human cognitive limits. The entire research program was essentially a crash course in post-human evolution, designed to create a small population of enhanced individuals who could serve as intermediaries between normal humanity and intelligence forms that operated on completely different conceptual frameworks. The secrecy wasn't just about protecting dangerous technologies. It was about preventing panic over the fact that humanity was apparently not alone in the universe and might not be the most advanced intelligence in our local region of space. As our storyteller began their new role, they carried with them the understanding that the story they had lived through was just the beginning of a much larger narrative. Humanity was on the threshold of discoveries that would fundamentally alter its understanding of reality, consciousness, and its place in the universe. The careful, secret work being done at facilities like Facility 7 was all that stood between controlled evolution toward greater capability and chaotic collapse in the face of revelations that could shatter the psychological foundations of human civilization. The employees who had started as simple industrial workers had become participants in the most important project in human history, managing the species' transition from a single-planet civilization to something capable of taking its place among the advanced intelligences that apparently populated the universe. The knowledge they carried was both humanity's greatest secret and its greatest hope for survival and growth beyond the limitations of baseline human existence. And that's where this incredible story ends, or perhaps where it actually begins, because what we've heard today isn't just an account of strange events at a mysterious facility. It's a glimpse into what might be humanity's actual future, and the careful, secret work that's apparently being done to make sure we survive long enough to reach it. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to subscribe to Chronicles of Curiosity for more incredible accounts from the hidden corners of our world, where reality operates according to different rules than we've been taught to expect. But before we wrap up, I want to share some additional details that our storyteller provided about their ongoing work within the research program, because these revelations shed even more light on just how extensive these operations really are. During their first year as a liaison coordinator, our storyteller was granted access to what the program called the Historical Archive, a collection of documents and artifacts that traced the research program's origins back much further than anyone had initially realized. The exotic materials that formed the foundation of all their advanced research weren't recent discoveries. They had apparently been recovered and studied intermittently for over a century, with the modern research program representing just the latest phase of investigations that began in the late 1800s. The archive contained reports from expeditions that had recovered anomalous materials from locations around the world, deep ocean trenches that contained structures of obviously artificial origin, archaeological sites where conventional dating methods produced impossible results, and remote wilderness areas where the local electromagnetic environment displayed properties that couldn't be explained by any known geological processes. What made these historical documents particularly unsettling was their suggestion that previous generations of researchers had made significant progress in understanding the materials, only to have their work mysteriously terminated, or their findings classified at levels that effectively removed them from human knowledge. The current research program wasn't pioneering new discoveries, so much as rediscovering capabilities that had been achieved and then deliberately forgotten multiple times throughout recent history. The reasons for these repeated cycles of discovery and suppression became clearer as our storyteller gained access to more sensitive historical records. Each previous generation of researchers had eventually reached the same conclusion that the current program was grappling with. The exotic materials and their associated technologies were powerful enough to fundamentally alter human civilization, but implementing them prematurely carried risks that could threaten the survival of the species itself. Previous attempts at controlled disclosure had apparently ended badly. The archive contained records of incidents where limited release of exotic technologies had triggered social upheavals that required massive coordinated efforts to suppress. In some cases, entire scientific communities had been infiltrated and their research redirected to prevent them from independently rediscovering principles that the secret programs were trying to manage carefully. The most disturbing historical records described what the archive referred to as containment failures, incidents where exotic materials or consciousness interface phenomena had escaped controlled research environments and begun affecting larger populations. These events had apparently required intervention methods that bordered on the unthinkable, including the use of the very consciousness modification techniques that the research program had developed to essentially erase public awareness of anomalous events. The implications were staggering. If the historical records were accurate, then significant portions of recent human history might have been actively managed to prevent awareness of discoveries that could have transformed civilization decades or even centuries ago. Scientific breakthroughs that should have revolutionized human understanding had been suppressed, redirected, or forgotten to maintain social stability, while researchers worked on methods for safely implementing radically advanced capabilities. Our storyteller's role as liaison coordinator involved helping newly integrated personnel understand and cope with these historical revelations. Many individuals who completed the integration therapy experienced a form of existential crisis when they realized how extensively human knowledge and social development had been managed by hidden programs working toward goals that transcended conventional political or economic frameworks. The psychological support systems that had been developed for this purpose were themselves examples of the advanced capabilities the research program had achieved. Consciousness interface techniques allowed trained counselors to directly share cognitive frameworks that helped individuals process revelations that would normally cause complete psychological breakdown. The therapy wasn't just about providing information. It involved temporary modification of neural processing patterns to allow absorption of concepts that baseline human consciousness couldn't normally handle. These advanced therapeutic techniques revealed just how far the research program's capabilities had progressed beyond anything available to conventional medicine or psychology. The consciousness modification technologies weren't crude behavioral conditioning methods. They were precise tools that could enhance specific cognitive abilities while leaving personality and individual identity completely intact. But the existence of these capabilities raised disturbing questions about consent and human autonomy. If consciousness could be modified with such precision, how could anyone be certain that their thoughts and decisions were truly their own? The research program had apparently grappled with these ethical implications for decades, developing elaborate safeguards and oversight mechanisms to prevent abuse of consciousness modification technologies. The safeguards included what the program called metacognitive monitoring. Enhanced individuals were trained to recognize when their consciousness had been artificially modified and retained the ability to reject or reverse modifications that they hadn't explicitly consented to. This created a form of psychological immune system that protected enhanced individuals from unwanted mental interference while allowing them to benefit from controlled consciousness improvements. Our storyteller's work involved implementing these safeguards with newly integrated personnel, while also helping them understand their expanded responsibilities as participants in humanity's managed evolution. The role required constant balance between providing necessary information and avoiding psychological overload that could cause integration failures. Integration failures were apparently a serious concern. Individuals who couldn't successfully adapt to enhanced consciousness capabilities posed risks not just to themselves, but to the entire research program. Failed integrations could result in individuals with partial access to exotic technologies, but without the psychological framework necessary to use them safely. These individuals required specialized containment and rehabilitation procedures that consumed significant program resources. The most concerning aspect of integration failures was their potential to create what researchers termed cascade events, situations where an individual with failed consciousness enhancement could trigger anomalous effects that spread to other people in their vicinity. These events could potentially expose the research program's existence, while simultaneously demonstrating exotic capabilities that unprepared populations couldn't safely process. Prevention of cascade events required sophisticated monitoring systems that tracked the psychological state of all enhanced individuals in real time. The monitoring wasn't invasive in conventional terms. It used the same consciousness interface phenomena that enabled the exotic technologies to detect signs of psychological instability before they could manifest as reality distortions. This monitoring system revealed that enhanced individuals existed in much larger numbers than our storyteller had initially realized. The research program hadn't just been operating secret facilities for materials research. It had been gradually creating a hidden population of cognitively enhanced humans who were embedded throughout normal society while working toward the program's long-term objectives. These embedded, enhanced individuals served multiple functions. Some worked in conventional scientific and technological fields, subtly steering research directions away from discoveries that could lead to premature recognition of exotic phenomena. Others held positions in government, media, and education systems, where they could influence public perception and social development in ways that prepared humanity for eventual disclosure of advanced capabilities. The scope of this embedded network was breathtaking. Enhanced individuals apparently held key positions in major universities, research institutions, technology companies, and government agencies around the world. They formed a hidden infrastructure that was quietly managing human scientific and social progress to ensure that the species would be psychologically and culturally prepared for the transition to post-human technological capability. But this network operated according to principles that transcended conventional national or organizational loyalties. Enhanced individuals maintained their original identities and relationships, while serving objectives that prioritized species-level concerns over local political or economic interests. This created a form of shadow governance that influenced major decisions affecting human development without conventional democratic accountability. The ethical implications of this arrangement were enormous and formed a major part of the integration therapy that new personnel underwent. Participants had to grapple with the realization that they were joining a project that had been subtly influencing human civilization for generations while operating completely outside normal social and political frameworks. The justification for these methods centered on the research program's conclusion that conventional democratic processes were fundamentally incapable of managing decisions that involved existential risks to the entire species. Public debate about exotic technologies and consciousness enhancement would likely trigger social conflicts that could prevent successful implementation of capabilities necessary for human survival and advancement. Our storyteller's work involved helping newly integrated personnel understand and accept these justifications while developing their own ethical frameworks for participating in species-level decision-making. The process required individuals to expand their moral reasoning beyond conventional human-scale considerations to encompass scenarios that involved potential interactions with non-human intelligence and cosmic-scale implications. The training for this expanded moral reasoning involved direct experience with some of the consciousness interface phenomena that the research program had developed. Participants were allowed to temporarily access cognitive frameworks that operated on vastly expanded timescales and spatial scales, giving them experiential understanding of how local human concerns related to larger patterns of intelligence development throughout the universe. These experiences revealed that the research program's activities were apparently part of a much larger pattern of intelligence evolution that occurred throughout cosmic history. The non-human entities that had originally created some of the exotic materials were themselves products of similar evolutionary processes that had occurred in their own species' development. The consciousness enhancement technologies weren't human innovations. They were standard tools that emerging intelligences used to manage their transition from planetary to cosmic scale awareness. The realization that humanity was following a developmental path that other species had traveled before, provided both reassurance and additional pressure. The process had apparently been successful for other intelligences, suggesting that human civilization could successfully navigate the transition to post-human capability. But it also implied that failure to successfully complete the transition could result in species extinction or reduction to permanently limited evolutionary potential. Our storyteller's final months in the liaison coordinator role involved preparation for what the research program called phase transition events. For years, carefully planned public disclosures of selected exotic technologies that would begin the process of gradually introducing humanity to its expanded capabilities. These events weren't random or uncontrolled. They were precisely orchestrated to maximize public adaptation while minimizing social disruption. The preparation involved coordination between enhanced individuals embedded throughout global society to ensure that appropriate support systems would be in place when public awareness of exotic technologies began to increase. Educational institutions would need new curricula. Medical systems would require training in consciousness, modification safety, and legal frameworks would need updating to address the implications of cognitive enhancement and reality manipulation capabilities. The scope of preparation revealed just how extensively the research program had been planning for eventual disclosure. The work involved thousands of enhanced individuals coordinating activities across every major human institution while maintaining absolute secrecy about their true objectives. The level of organization and long-term planning exceeded anything that conventional governments or corporations had ever achieved. As our storyteller prepared to transition to an even higher level of program participation, they were granted access to what might be the most significant revelation of all: direct communication logs with the non-human intelligences that were apparently monitoring and occasionally guiding humanity's consciousness evolution process. These communications revealed that humanity's development toward post-human capability was occurring within a larger framework of cosmic intelligence evolution that included multiple species across vast regions of space and time. The process wasn't unique to humans. It was a standard phase of development that emerging intelligences underwent as they evolved from planetary to cosmic scale awareness and capability. The non-human entities involved in this process weren't conquerors or exploiters. They were essentially cosmic mentors who provided guidance and resources to help emerging intelligences successfully navigate the critical transition period when species first gained access to reality manipulation technologies. Their involvement was carefully limited to prevent interference with natural development patterns, while providing just enough support to prevent extinction-level failures. The exotic materials that formed the foundation of the research program were apparently gifts from these mentor entities, as samples of technologies and physical principles that emerging intelligences would eventually need to understand in order to take their place in the larger cosmic community. The materials weren't randomly distributed. They were provided to species that showed signs of approaching readiness for consciousness evolution. And that brings us to the end of this remarkable account. Though, as our storyteller emphasized, it's really just the beginning of a story that will ultimately involve every human being on Earth. We're apparently living through the early stages of humanity's transition from a single-planet species to something capable of participating in cosmic-scale intelligence communities that span the universe. The careful, secret work being done at facilities like Facility 7 isn't just about protecting dangerous technologies or maintaining government secrecy. It's about managing the most important transition in human history, our evolution from baseline biological intelligence to enhanced consciousness capable of understanding and utilizing the fundamental forces that shape reality itself. If this story has captured your imagination the way it captured mine, remember to subscribe to Chronicles of Curiosity and hit that notification bell, because if even a fraction of what we've heard today is true, then we're all about to become part of the most extraordinary chapter in human history, and you definitely don't want to miss what happens next.